it seems like we've had a trend of every major PC release coming out this year having serious performance optimization issues. And is Redfall going to be next? This is the official launch trailer here, and while the game looks nice in its way, I've got to say I'm not completely blown away by anything I'm seeing here. And this game is coming out in just a couple of days, and I don't mind it. Maybe that's just my thoughts on the art style or whatever. So you can look at when it's coming out. It's coming out very soon, so May 1st or May 2nd, depending on where you are in the world. But the thing is, I don't have any real issue with the game's visuals, but I'm a little bit curious about some signs that I'm curious about the optimization given what we're seeing on the screen, because I'm seeing headlines that Redfall will only have a 30 frames per second quality mode on Xbox at launch. The 60 FPS mode will be added later. Okay, that's interesting. Now, it is saying that the Series X should be able to run it at 4K 30 frames per second, and the Series S at 1440p 30 frames per second. And again, they're promising that we'll get the 60 FPS mode added in later. But guys, given that PC optimization tends to be a complete afterthought, I'm a little concerned when I see it reported that even the console game won't have a 60 frames per second mode. Now, backing this up, it does look like the boxes have been pictured showing a 60 frames per second mode listed on the box. So they were clearly trying to deliver a 60 frames per second mode, but it looks like the last minute optimizations before launch date probably just weren't able to get them there. And so we're seeing reports that it'll come with a sticker noting that that won't actually be available at launch. So with all of that being said, I looked up what are the PC system requirements. I mean, we don't have the game out yet to actually test, although let me know if you're interested. By the way, the game is going to be a day one Game Pass game, so at least you can get in the door with a low, price of a Game Pass subscription rather than needing to buy the whole game and then refund it if it doesn't run well. But hopefully I'm right. Hopefully it just runs great on PC. At first, the system requirements, well, let's dig in here a little bit. First of all, I will say that compared to what we get from a lot of games nowadays, I hate the system requirements list just in terms of the information it gives us. So we get a minimum, we get a recommended, and we get an ultra, but it does not tell us what resolution or graphics settings or frame rate any of this is targeting. So I've got to say that I unfortunately can't give you guys anywhere near the amount of detail on all of this that I would usually do, because their system requirements simply aren't giving me as much detail as I can usually get for you. So, in other words, are these ultra specs for 4K 60 frames per second? Or are they for 1080p ultra? 60 frames per second, or 30 frames per second? This could mean a lot of different things. Also, I'm curious if they're having trouble getting a 60 frames per second mode, right? Locking into 30 frames per second mode. I am curious if can it be a CPU bound issue? We're seeing that a lot on PC, where it's taking a ridiculously high-end CPU to run the games at high frame rates, especially in Unreal Engine 4 games, and I believe this is an Unreal Engine 4 game. So I'm really curious how much the CPU ties into this. Because a lot of times a minimum spec is running the game at 1080p or even 720p low settings, 30 frames per second. Now this doesn't say that that's what it is, but that could be what this is. And I will note that the CPUs it's listing here aren't super low end or super old like we see on a lot of system requirements lists for a 38 frames per second experience. It's listing Core i5-8400, which is a 6-core, 6-thread CPU from 2017. Okay, I get that's like 6 years old, and it's not the most powerful one around from that time. But again, if this is really only targeting 30 frames per second, which it doesn't say, right? It doesn't say, I don't know, but that's curious. It's listing the AMD alternative as 6-core, 12-thread Ryzen 5 1600, which also is a 2017 chip. Now, sometimes system requirements charts, you can just read way too much into it, like maybe this is just the oldest CPUs that they had on hand to test, and it worked, so they listed them, right? I don't want to read way too much into that. And jumping up to the recommended specs, which at least usually games are, system requirements lists are listing a 60 FPS experience, at least most of the time, for their recommended. Although it doesn't say that here, so I can't guarantee it. They're moving up to a Core i7-9700K or Ryzen 7 2700X. The 9700K is an 8-core, 8-thread CPU from Intel from 2018, and the Ryzen 7 2700X is 8-core, 16-thread from AMD in 2018. So again, fairly recent. Also, I feel like the 2700X is fairly similar to what you get in like an Xbox Series X or a PS5, although I think those are a bit more optimized. I think it might be more like a 3700X, and so it's not exactly equivalent. And also just the way consoles handle their CPU tasks is very different than how PCs do in a lot of situations. Now, the minimum GPU they list is an RX 580. Okay, so the RX 580 and the GTX 1070, they also specifically mention 6 gigabytes of VRAM. Now, this is a weird pairing from my perspective because the RX 580 has 8 gigabytes, and so does the GTX 1070. The GTX 1060 performs more like an RX 580 and has 6 gigabytes, and yet that's not the NVIDIA GPU that they chose to list. So that's interesting. If we look, to back me up on this, if you go to Tech Power Up, which has one of the, I think the best relative performance chart that you can find. However, that's being said, well, it's based on their review data. That data for older GPUs can be very outdated. There could have been a lot of driver updates since then. Sometimes older graphics cards in newer APIs like DX12 perform differently, and every game's different, every engine's different. So with all those caveats out of the way, usually the GTX 1060 with 6 gigabytes performs very closely to an RX 580 from AMD, and the GTX 1070 is usually more like 30% faster. Now, again, different games can perform differently. But again, what these do have in common is they're both 8 gigabyte cards, although this is specifically mentioning 6 gigabytes. So I don't want to say it has to be 8 gigabytes on the minimum spec, but at the same time, they're listing 8 gigabyte cards, and that seems to be what they have in common. So again, this feels weird on the system requirements. We'll need to get some benchmarks out on this one, I think. We'll see what happens. Anyway, so if you have like a GTX 1060, like I said, that's usually pretty close to the performance of the RX 580. But again, we're saying this is like minimum spec level, and officially they did list a higher end. So, a lot of GPUs like a GTX 1650 is actually noticeably weaker than this. RX 6400, ARC A380. GPUs like that would be below the minimum spec here. And again, they're not telling us, if this is for 60 frames per second, I don't think this is unreasonable. But if this is 1080p low, or even 720p low 30 frames per second, then this would be pretty concerning. But again, we don't know. We just don't know at this point, so I shouldn't dwell on it too much. But you might be able to find your GPU nearby in this performance chart. Somewhere in this range puts you at the minimum spec, right? So if we go above minimum spec, by the way, the RTX 3050 is fairly similar in performance to a GTX 1070, so that's right around your minimum spec, if we trust that. Notice they do say 16 gigabytes of RAM for minimum. Also for recommended, although the ultra spec does jump up to 32 gigabytes. The CPUs stay the same between recommended and ultra. 100 gigabyte game as well. Anyway, let's jump up, and SSD, by the way, minimum spec. That doesn't mean you won't be able to run it on a hard drive, but you might see issues. Games for current gen consoles are designed to run on SSDs. Now, recommended spec, GPU AMD 5700, NVIDIA RTX 2080, or it just says Intel Arc. Intel Arc. It doesn't say which one. Intel does produce more than one Arc GPU, Bethesda. Anyway, and they do list 8 gigabytes of VRAM here. So let's take a look at this. An AMD 5700 or an RTX 2080, and they're listing 8 gigabytes of VRAM specifically. So if we jump up from the RX 580 to the RX 5700, that's a 61% performance increase. It was the non-X version, right? Yeah, it says non-X. Now that's a bit weird because they're also listing the RTX 2080. If I click on the RX 5700, set that as the baseline now, we can say, okay, that's our recommended AMD GPU. That would be similar in performance to something like a GTX 1080 or an RTX 2060. However, they specifically listed an RTX 2080 which is, again, about 30% faster than the RX 5700, which is weird, because we also saw about a 30% performance difference between these two. So are they just trying to give us a range of values? Is this just the cards they have on hand? This feels weird, and I can't really compare to Intel Arc, because Intel Arc, I would guess they mean the A770, because that's kind of in this range. But the A750 is also in this range. Well, the A380 is way below this range. So anyway, just if they weren't aware, there is more than one Intel Arc GPU. Now, if we did want to jump up to the ultra specs, they're listing an AMD RX 6800 XT or an RTX 3080. They're specifically listing 10 gigabytes of VRAM, which is what the RTX 3080 has. Now, I am curious what resolution this is, right? Again, is this 1080p ultra 60 frames per second? Is this 1440p ultra 60 frames per second? Is this 4K ultra 60 frames per second? Is this 4K ultra 30 frames per second? Because again, the consoles are only targeting 30 FPS, at least for now. I don't know, but the GPUs they're listing are the 6800 XT and the RTX 3080. And so if we scroll up, if we set the 5700 as the baseline, that was the recommended GPU, and now we're trying to find the Ultra GPU from AMD, you can maybe find your GPU somewhere in between. Here we have the 6800 XT. This is a doubling of performance. So maybe we're going from 30 frames per second to 60 frames per second. Maybe the Ultra settings are just a lot more demanding. Maybe we're jumping up from 1440p to 4K. I don't know, but it is a doubling of performance for what they're asking on the GPU. Now, if we click on this one as the baseline and we look at the RTX 3080, these actually are usually fairly close in performance. So this is finally actually a reasonable pairing between the two. I don't know, guys. What do you think about all of this? From the system requirements, in and of themselves, this might not be concerning, depending on if these are targeting like 60 frames per second with good settings. If this is just 30 frames per second at extremely low and like 720p or something, that's a bit more concerning. Like I said, also these CPUs. If these CPUs are delivering you 60 frames per second, maybe this isn't that big of a deal. If these are only getting you 30 frames per second, that could be a little bit more concerning. We'll have to see what happens with all of this. Again, release time's here, and it is supposed to be a day one Game Pass game as well. So that might be how you'd get into there with a little bit less risk. So what do you guys think? Is this going to be a good optimized game? We're going to be fine. Hard to tell from the system requirements. I'm just hoping that that we get at least one well-optimized PC game this year. I hope all of you have an excellent day.